I'm Jeff Zarnett, and this is Software Career Growth. Today, we're going to be talking about code reviews. All right, welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking about code reviews, and I don't want to focus too much on why we do them. I think there's some pretty good articles out there that explain the importance of it and show the impact that they have on code quality. But I want to talk about some suggestions for what you can do to be better at being a code reviewer. Why do I think that's important in particular? Well, you see, I think being a better code reviewer is an important part of advancing in your career. It's very easy to just say everything looks good and ship it, but that's not actually what you should be doing. What really should happen is like a really careful and thoughtful review of the code that you are asked to look at. So I think it matters, and I think if you're good at it, and I think if you do a good job, it improves the code, not only that you write, because, well, you can look at your own code with code reviewer eyes, but also the code of your team, and that's good overall, right? There's more to your impact than just what you do yourself. It's also how do you help others get better. So I want to start out by talking about what you should not do. And the first thing that should not happen is nitpicking about style and variable names and like all the tiny little details. Ideally, your company has some sort of coding standard. Maybe your project has coding standards that may be separate or more strict than the actual company coding standards. But those kinds of things, they're easy to automate, right? You can use a lint tool, you can use an auto formatter. Don't waste your time on those kinds of things. If those things are not included in your compilation or build process, they should be. But for the most part, no one really wants to be hassled about whether the curly brace should be on the next line or the same line. That does matter for code style, but it shouldn't be the focus of the code review. Make that automated, make it irrelevant. With that said, I will make an exception on the variable names thing. You can talk about variable names if, for example, the variable name is misleading, right? It's a physics calculation and the thing is called force when it really should be called acceleration. That one I would actually complain about because that is misleading to somebody who's going to read in the code later. But things that are actually interesting to pay attention to, one thing that I think about is, are we validating inputs? Right? When a function is called, is there some sort of check that validates, is this null, is this not null, is it in range, is it valid in some way? Right? Checks to see if it's valid and rejecting the request if the request is invalid are usually better to have sooner rather than later in the code, as opposed to finding out later when you try to apply the change in the database. Turns out, oh, the company didn't exist. Well, it might have been interesting to validate that the company exists first. So checking your input, checking that they are the correct type, that they are the correct length, that they are formatted appropriately, that if they have encoding, that they're in the correct encoding. All of those things are really helpful and something you can look for in your code review. The other thing that I would suggest to look for related to that is, are we sure that we are handling it well if some third-party service returns an error or returns an answer of no? If that situation happens, it should be possible to look at that and say, okay, in this case, we say, sorry, we're not able to process your request. Please try again later. And that's much better than just crashing or otherwise going off the rails, right? Related to that, one of the things that I really do not like to see when I am doing a code review is something that is known as the anti-pattern of exception as control flow. And I like to say that no is a valid answer. Right? That when you are designing your program, if it is supposed to charge the customer for some money, it is possible that you get a no answer back when you try to charge them. Card was declined, they don't have money in their account, whatever it is. And you can, if you want, treat that as an exception, but I don't think that's good design because I think no is a valid answer. It is within the foreseeable that you could actually get back an answer that says, sorry, the customer doesn't have enough funds, or they've canceled their payment card. And handling that in regular code is better than handling it with an exception. Exceptions are good for like network is down or payment processor is not responding in time, but it's important to avoid those kind of anti-patterns and things that we sort of do not like to see. Next thing that I would like to look for is some documentation. Documentation doesn't have to be super extensive. Ideally, you have code that explains itself pretty well, but anything that looks very strange or that is non-obvious to somebody may need some explanation. And be mindful, of course, if something that looks non-obvious to a junior person may be entirely obvious to people who have a little bit more experience, and that's okay. But I don't think it's wrong to ask for a little bit of explanation about sort of what is the intent of the code. And I emphasize in that sentence the word intent. Describing what the code does is not the purpose of the comment. What it actually should be is about why the code is doing the thing that it is doing. Then another thing that I want to look at is tests. Is the code testable? Is there a way that you can call this function with some inputs, or does it rely too heavily on the fact that, everything has to happen in a certain sequence, right? Is it possible to initialize the objects such that you can test it? Is it possible to call the function with different arguments to make sense, right? And I assume when you're looking at this, the tests exist. You should probably say no to the code review if the tests do not exist. But are they comprehensive enough, right? Do they cover things that need covering? And that includes not just sort of the easy cases where everything goes well, but do they handle error conditions? Do they reject a request if the request is invalid? Do they choose to handle things in a good way if a retry is necessary? Making sure that some edge cases and corner cases are actually covered are fairly important in the code review. Other things that I would look for, if the pull request is really large, you might ask a person who is making it, if it's possible for them to split it somehow. Is there a way that they can make this pull request less of a gigantic one? That's not always possible, but it might be good feedback for the person who is making this pull request that in the future, smaller pull requests are faster and easier to review. Another thing that I would like to look out for is around deployment. If there's anything in this that when we launch it, it's going to be incompatible with an existing version, is there a plan for doing that? And to give a specific example, sometimes you are making a change when you are building a new version of the application that changes the structure of the database. And this is potentially a problem because if you are launching this, right, the existing nodes will use the old schema and the new nodes want to use the new schema. And if you change the schema, then the old nodes that are still running are very confused. That's not going to work. Alternatively, if you don't change the schema just yet, the new nodes that are expecting the new schema aren't working as they should, and you don't want that problem. Right? So if there is some sort of strategy for migration that's needed, then that makes sense. And it doesn't even have to be a change in the structure of the data. It could be a change in the format of the data. If you are migrating from this format to another format, right, how do we make sure that that transition takes place such that everything works out? And your plan doesn't have to necessarily be solved with code. You could say the answer is actually downtime for the application will be fine while we do this migration, as long as that's known and accounted for and planned and treated appropriately, right? So that sort of thing covers the deployment part of stuff. Then the other things to look out for effectively is when we see something in the code that looks kind of like we're not the first person to solve this problem, you could question whether this could be replaced with some sort of library code, right? If someone has implemented their own search or sort routine, you could question, is it actually optimal to have our own? It's not to say that the answer is always no. Sometimes there is a reason why having our own sorting routine makes sense, or there's something special that we know about this that makes this more efficient, or something like that. But it is worth questioning, right? It is definitely unusual to need to implement your own search routine. So if there's no explanation for that, at the very least you should ask for there to be a comment explaining why we can't use a standard library sorting routine. On that subject, if you leave a comment or something like that, somebody may have an answer to that question. So in your code reviewing tool, on the website, you type in a comment and somebody replies to the comment and they say, oh, because of this, this is why. I like to follow up with that and say, could you add that as a comment in the actual code? On the theory that somebody else might have the same question in the future, and it's a little bit easier if it's documented there as opposed to having to dig through the history of the pull request that added this and look potentially like leaving your code editor, going to a website to try to figure out what has actually been responsible or what has been the explanation for this change. The other thing that I would say is sort of interesting to look out for is there any log or debug stuff that could be removed, right? When we build something, we sometimes have extra logging statements that help us to trace the execution of the thing, or extra debug statements that help us track down a particular problem. And as the author, you may not notice those as they are there. And if you are, as a reviewer, finding those, you say, hey, do we still need this? That's pretty good. Right, that's a nice find, so it makes the code a little bit simpler and makes it easier to review. On that subject, I think observing the logging and sort of taking a look at that is kind of interesting, right? Traceability in your program is a whole separate discussion, right? But you probably do want your program to log at least a little bit about what it's doing. And I want those logs to be informative, right? If it just says retrieving company, that's maybe not so helpful to me down the road trying to figure out what went wrong or trying to debug a problem or trying to just trace how did this customer get into this state. So I would usually leave as a suggestion something that says, okay, retrieving company and then company ID, just to make it a little bit clearer that if I do look at, okay, a response that comes from this request, and I can see the history, and I can see we retrieved this company, we did this, we did that, that information might be actually useful a little bit later on. But it's important not to log too much, because if you're logging things that are like personally identifiable information, that's not good. The security and privacy team might not like that. So if you do spot something also in the logging where you're logging too much as opposed to too little, you're logging an email address or a person's real name, that kind of thing is generally looked down upon by the security and privacy teams. So make sure you point those out as well. Finally, at the end of it, the purpose of the code review at the end of the day is to make a better work product, and somebody may not like your suggestion, and that's okay. They don't have to take it. I mean, some suggestions are not really suggestions. If it is indeed, please delete this logging of personal information from the log, then yeah, that's not really a suggestion. But if you say, oh, I think it would be better to do this, and the other person says no, that's okay. They're allowed to choose that. It's important to not let ego get in the way of things. So it's okay if somebody says, I've considered your request, but I would rather not. So those are my suggestions about how to do code reviews effectively. Hope it was helpful. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.